Welcome back. What a fantastic start to the event. That laid the foundations for further debate, insights, and collaboration on resilience. All this content will be available on demand after 24 hours after the event, and it'll be hosted on the Business of Resilience event site. To build on that foundation, we will have an intervention from Greg Case shortly. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the three concurrent panels that will follow that. Please do select which one of these panels you'd like to engage with, but recognizing that you will be able to join them all at a later date. The first panel looks at the role of insurance in resilience and public assets. We're meeting at a time when public sector resources are stretched at historic levels. Therefore, it's important to mobilize and access other pools of capital. The insurance industry is a $2 trillion pool of capital. But equally, it has important technical and human expertise that can support public sector objectives in achieving resilience. This panel is going to be introduced and chaired by Claudia Time, Director of Strategic Market Development at AXA XL. And on the panel, we'll have representations from the City of Glasgow, COP26 Stakeholder Management. We'll have Renaissance Re, the large Bermudan reinsurance company, Willis Towers Watson, and Dominic Christian, the Global Chairman of Aon Re Solutions. The second panel is going to look at insurance and development finance. Development finance institutions should play an important role in crowding in private sector capital. The emergence of blended finance solutions is becoming increasingly important. This session is going to be chaired by Jan Kellett. Jan is the external engagement for the Financial Sector Hub of the UNDP. We'll have representations from the World Bank, the Africa Risk Capacity, Centre for Disaster Risk, Insure Resilience, and the Insurance Development Forum. The third panel is going to be looking at the role of free trade in promoting supply chain resilience. Free trade has underpinned decades of robust economic growth. The most important source of resilience is growth. However, it can also lead to the introduction of fragility, and finding the balance between free trade and robust supply chains is important. Therefore, this panel will be moderated by Andrew Mitchell, the Director General of Markets and Supply Chains at the Department for International Trade. He'll be joined by Michael Liebreich Associates, and Aditi Sahani of Vivid Economics, along with Professor Richard Wilding of Cranfield University and Jeff Townsend of the Critical Minerals Association. Do go to the networking lounge to continue the conversation throughout the event and to engage with your fellow delegates. After the panels, we'll have a 10-minute break and I'll be back to introduce you to the next two panels. But before the panels, I'll hand over to Greg Case, Global CEO of Aon. Greg has some great insights to share and points out that we should not just be thinking about a new normal, but a new better. Greg.
Thank you, Julian, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join this Business of Resilience conference. You're doing vitally important work to raise awareness about the greatest challenges economies and communities around the world are confronting today. And you clearly recognize that our greatest opportunity rests in our ability to join together across public and private sectors to develop new approaches and new solutions to address these evolving challenges. Thank you also for including my colleague Dominic Christian, Aon's Global Chairman for Reinsurance, who will join others on a panel discussing the role of insurance and resilience in public assets. I'm sure that'll be one of many sessions over these 2 days, providing valuable insight and perspective. I have to tell you, it's certainly no surprise that this group is leading the way and bringing together experts and key stakeholders to advance our thinking and to be a catalyst for action on new strategies for strengthening resilience. The UK, and London in particular, is well established as an innovation center in developing new approaches to the most complex and challenging emerging risks. And for me, it's an honor to join you in this effort. As you engage in discussions during this conference, I hope it's helpful for me to share a perspective reflecting on what we and our clients experienced in 2020 and the landscape we see in the year ahead. In this context, I'm struck by two observations. First, over the past year of economic lockdowns and adjustments we've all had to make in the ways we live and work, many have commented about the need to accept the new normal. While well-intended, the new normal often foreshadows a world that's more negative or even corrosive. It's based on a premise that our best hope is to endure and to maintain the status quo, or even accept something a little less. Instead, what we've seen from many companies around the world is a fundamentally different perspective. In fact, one that demands we all reframe our perspective, rejecting the idea of the new normal. In its place, we can embrace what we've been referring to as the new better. New better means that we retain and even expand our high aspirations. We see so many opportunities to continue pressing forward, finding new ways to remain connected and supportive of each other, accelerating innovation agendas in the face of the pandemic. New better is not easier, but clearly better. We've seen an incredible sense of resilience and determination among our colleagues at Aon and among our clients we are privileged to serve. And I'm sure that many of you have experienced the same in your organizations. This conference, with even more extensive connections and attendance, reflects a version of new better. With new better, we can all define new and more inspiring ways of moving forward. The second observation I would offer may be best described as a great awakening by CEOs and others in C-suites around the world to the next generation of long-tail risks. As we all experienced the pandemic, and some organizations found they were more prepared than others, many leaders are asking questions about what else could emerge. The next pandemic. How should we be preparing for the impact of climate change? How do we value, protect, and unlock the potential intangible assets? How do we identify and protect ourselves from evolving and growing cyber risks? How do we support the health and wealth of all employees? How will we work, travel, and convene in the future? The common theme to all these challenges is that we used to speak about many of them as being on the horizon. The past year has demonstrated how they're very much now on the front porch. And I would offer that this perspective is not limited to the risk industry. A prominent tech CEO at a recent event called out the idea of long-tail risks and what they require from all of us as leaders across the public and private sectors. We're observing a fundamental reordering of client priorities on a global scale. The world has woken up to the challenge of long-tail risks and is listening. What do we have to say? When we think about our industry, there's so much more we can and must do to help. The pandemic has underscored the volatility and connectivity of our world, emphasizing the need for enhanced collaboration between the public and private sectors. The scale of the challenge is immense. Consider, for example, that in 2020, uninsured losses related to weather, climate, and catastrophe totaled nearly $270 billion. Further, some parts of the world are far more vulnerable than others. More than 90% of these losses are uninsured in parts of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The protection gap places a substantial financial strain on governments, businesses, communities, and individuals. Yet the financial impact is only a secondary aspect of the toll these challenges inflict. We also must consider the profoundly troubling humanitarian and social impact, lives lost, communities compromised, and livelihoods disrupted. And while we can't prevent future earthquakes, typhoons, wildfires, and floods, if it were in our power to do more in assisting these communities in preparing, protecting, and then recovering after disaster, are we not compelled to act? Considering the magnitude of the challenge, a solution is beyond the ability of any individual leader, organization, or even sector. However, we have absolute conviction that collectively we can make a difference. Together, we have a profound and compelling opportunity to explore how we, as an industry, can better partner with the public sectors and others. Each sector represented at this conference brings unique perspective, capabilities, and resources that can be directed toward this challenge. We look forward to working together with all of you, innovating and developing more comprehensive solutions that will close the rising protection gap and build greater resilience. Together, we can embrace and create a
So, good afternoon, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to this panel session at the Business of Resilience Conference 2021, where I'm joined by 4 distinguished panelists to discuss the timely topic of the role of free trade in promoting supply chain resilience. My name is Andrew Mitchell. I am Director General for Exports and UK Trade at the Department for International Trade. and it is my pleasure to chair this panel this afternoon. I would encourage you, please, to use the live Q&A function so that we can cover your questions, your comments, your thoughts later on as we get into the question and answer part of today's panel discussion. My own role, just by way of background, encompasses our work on supply chain resilience. Around 12 months ago, I left my job as Trade Commissioner for Europe at the Department for International Trade to pick up the responsibility of leading the work that we did to procure PPE, ventilators, other medical supplies through the COVID crisis, and therefore experienced firsthand what happens when supply chain resilience breaks down in a crisis. I've continued to lead, today the work that we do on supply chains, and it continues, in fact, to be a really fascinating piece of work for the department. A couple of reflections before I introduce our panelists from the past 12 months of leading this work. And the first is that although during the crisis many supply chains proved robust given the pressures, the pandemic really did demonstrate some notable and quite alarming fragilities, especially for products where there was a massive and rapid demand shock, such as PPE. And this showed us something about our dependency on global supply chains for critical goods, and on the risks that we'd effectively outsourced as a consequence. Many countries, of course, responded by restricting exports of medical goods, impacting existing channels of supply and highlighting the prevalence of geopolitical risk as part of supply chain resilience, something that we haven't truly encountered in that way previously. Second, though we learned that there are things that we can do to address these problems. Our starting point, of course, and this in a sense is the theme of the conference today, is to take a market-first approach. We prosper, in fact, from an open economy. Openness itself confers resilience. Third, data is key. We're bringing together information and data so that government can be better prepared for future disruption to supply chains. But without understanding how those supply chains operate, it's really impossible to take a holistic view. Fourth, the range of levers that we have available should always be considered in the round. And often a combination of levers may be the best solution to reduce a vulnerability. So my government recognises there's no one-size-fits-all model for building resilience, and that a sensitive mix of domestic and global sourcing is needed. To build resilience, we've considered a wide range of options, including diversifying global sourcing, engaging international partners, working with like-minded partners in particular to build critical supply chain resilience, creating strategic reserves, stockpiling where necessary to ensure resilience, especially for products at risk of demand spikes. We might also identify long-term opportunities to strengthen and protect UK supply through increased domestic production, where this is deemed necessary and economically viable. Fifth, the importance of international cooperation. Pandemic has helped us to think differently about how to use trade mechanisms to drive more resilient, diversified supply chains through an open markets, free trade based approach. And we're working closely with our global partners, both bilaterally, multilaterally, to establish greater international cooperation, to understand supply chain vulnerabilities, to share diagnosis and inform coordinated response to our shared challenges. Finally, a strategy such as this cannot exist on its own, needs to be built into plans for prosperity and growth. So we're assuring that supply chain resilience lies at the very heart of government strategy at every opportunity, particularly through the plan for growth revealed during the budget recently here in the UK. It's clear that strategy for resilience has to be embedded within industrial strategy. So that by way of introduction, I'd just like to turn now to our panelists. We're lucky enough to have four really distinguished folks to talk to us today. Each of them will speak for 3 to 4 minutes, after which we will start the question and answer session. So I'd like first to turn to Professor Wilding, Richard Wilding, OBE, Professor of Supply Chain Strategy at Cranfield University to introduce the topic for us today. Richard.
Thank you. So just a tiny bit of my background. I started off working in industry and I accidentally fell into academia many years ago. And I was actually probably the first professor of supply chain risk management in the world, we think. I had that appointment, but my title now is Professor of Supply Chain Strategy. And I work with organizations globally in really sort of looking at their supply chain strategies. And the reason why my title changed is because risk and resilience really starts with thinking through the supply chain strategy. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, just define, give you an academic definition to start with. What is supply chain resilience? And it's the adaptive capability of the supply chain to prepare for unexpected events, respond to disruptions, and also recover from them by maintaining continuity of operations at a desired level. So this is actually really quite important. Those three areas: we need to prepare, we need to respond, and we also need to be able to recover as we're moving forward. So when I'm sort of working with companies on building resilience, we need to understand the supply chain strategy. And this is very much linked to how we're creating value for particular customers. We have to think through carefully the product design for the supply chain. So product and service design for the supply chain is particularly important as we're moving forward. Collaboration and managing relationships is a key pillar of all this. And I can't emphasize that enough. Those organizations that have really done well have managed relationships. Managing relationships requires resource, it needs information systems, it needs people to really work globally in the management of relationships. They don't happen by accident. We need to focus on agility and flexibility, create a culture across the supply chain of thinking about supply chain risk management and resilience. In other words, people asking the question, if I'm actually going to procure from that location, how will it impact the risk profile of my supply chain? Sometimes it improves things, sometimes it can be detrimental. Key is thinking through supply chain transparency and also continuous monitoring and intelligence. So what we're seeing at the moment is, if you like, improved data flows globally, gaining transparency, people really asking the question about how are they operating globally to make all this work. So when we actually start to think through some of the key things for our new better or the new normal that we're really moving into, we are seeing a time of procuring for resilience rather than cost. And that is all, which has already been mentioned, is some of that might involve onshoring. Okay, so looking at things that we can actually do very locally onshore. However, it might also involve nearshoring, actually, if you like, reducing the supply chain length and doing things actually much closer to us. But really importantly, and this really emphasizes the importance of trade, is also multi-shoring. And what we've been finding is organizations that have been looking for multiple locations to source from. You know, we have the saying in the United Kingdom, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I was talking to one company recently who basically said, yes, we ended up with 3 suppliers in one location. The problem was they're all in the same region. And so when lockdown came, they were all locked down. Whereas if they'd thought about actually different shoring options, that would have given them some real opportunities. And key is as well is thinking about using technology wherever possible. That actually can really strengthen what we're doing, be it sort of data technology or even looking at automation in some places. But critically, it's also getting innovation in. And when we're talking about innovation, I generally find that's where collaboration, managing those relationships, if we do that well globally, enables us to innovate. I sometimes say that, you know, innovation is all about taking ideas which are new to you and creating economic, social, or environmental value. And that's really important because as we move into this more sustainable future, We've got to get ideas from everywhere. So it's great to be part of this discussion, and I hope that everybody's going to get some great ideas through this debate.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for that introduction and a really fascinating overview. Can I now turn to Aditi Sahini, who is Engagement Manager at Vivid Economics, to speak to us next. Aditi.
Thank you, Andrew. Just a bit on my background. So I, as Andrew said, work for Vivid Economics. It's an economics consultancy focusing on sustainability issues, and we recently became part of McKinsey & Company. I work in our area of disaster risk management and disaster risk finance, working with policymakers and industry on mainstreaming disaster risk management into their strategies and designing innovative instruments for risk transfer. So I just wanted to quickly start with a few points to make on the impact of the pandemic on the supply chain and on SMEs in particular. And then I wanted to talk a bit about solutions, both from a policymaker angle as well as a finance angle. So as we know, the pandemic has been one of the most significant shocks that the global supply chains have faced, really since we started to globalize decades ago. And what's different about the pandemic compared to other disasters is the scale of impacts. And as we know, with climate change, it's making extreme weather events like floods more frequent and severe, which is making such events common over time. So two key things to note about the impact of the pandemic. One, supply chain impacts during this event have propagated around the global system at scale. For example, factory closures in China have meant that 50% of SMEs in South Korea were unable to honor pre-agreed delivery dates. And second, supply chain risks have been a key point of vulnerability even for the financial systems. So for example, up to a third of microfinance institutions had insufficient capital to meet their outflows in Q3 of 2020. So that's a little bit on the impact of the pandemic on global supply chains. I wanted to touch upon the impact on SMEs in particular, which have been impacted to a greater level compared to other firms. To give you a bit of a sense of numbers, a survey indicated that in the UK, 60% of SMEs are likely to go out of business if they see any further revenue losses. And globally, while SMEs account for 50% of global GDP, they bear 75% of total business losses from disasters. So SMEs are generally very vulnerable because A, they are financially fragile and they lack access to finance to take up any risk reduction activities. Second, they are concentrated in sectors and regions that are exposed to risk, but also their operations and supply chains are more geographically concentrated. And they have a greater reliance on a smaller number of suppliers and customers. And C, SMEs in general have a lesser strategic focus on recovery, on prevention as compared to recovery. So part of the solution to avoid such impacts in the future for the global supply chains, as well as for SMEs, is to diversify more geographically. So something that Andrew was saying at the beginning. And second is to build resilience by investing into risk reduction activities. And all actors have a role to play to encourage this building of resilience within supply chains. So I wanted to briefly touch upon what's the role of policymakers in building supply chain resilience, and then on the role of finance as well. So first, in policymakers can do three things. First is that they can encourage the increased uptake of business continuity planning that has a particular focus on prevention. And they can do this by building the capacity of firms through training and by provision of risk information. And as Andrew said at the beginning, data is key. So risk information is very important. Second, policymakers can increase access to finance for risk reduction practices. And one way in which they can do this is by removing barriers for private finance. So for example, insurers could play a greater role in financing risk reduction but they are disincentivized currently by capital adequacy rules. And third, policymakers can also encourage the adoption of innovation and adoption of resilient business models. And this is something that Professor Richard was saying before, that digitalization is important. It's really, really important for resilient business models. So that's on policymakers. And finally, on finance, what's the role of finance? Two things there. First, finance can channel increased investment into risk reduction, and they can do this by designing innovative instruments, for example, business interruption insurance, or creating funds that invest into technologies and solutions for adaptation. And secondly, financiers can incentivize risk-reducing practices through terms of lending or insurance agreements. And an example of that is the Africa Risk Capacity. So they've come up with a facility called as Extreme Climate Facility, which seeks to tie insurance premium payments to the uptake of risk reduction by African farmers. So those are a few points from me. Really look forward to the discussion and the Q&A session.
Aditi, thank you so much for that. And I think this focus on SMEs is really valuable in this context. So often I think when we're talking about resilience, we do focus on the larger corporates and the big global value chains, but that focus on SMEs as part of that value chain is tremendously important, I think, and you've helpfully also identified the role of finance in that context, which likewise, particularly in the context of the discussion today, is very relevant. So let me now introduce our third speaker. Delighted to introduce Michael Liebrich. Michael is CEO of Liebrich Associates, and indeed an official advisor to the UK Board of Trade. So we're really pleased to have Michael join us here today. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. On what's obviously a very sunny day, you're in and out of shadows. It's a bit like Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now. I could just about see you there, but thanks for bringing me into the discussion. What I thought I could do is then, shift the discussion a little bit into the low carbon supply chains that we're currently building, because some of the context for this discussion is that we're not in business as usual. We are in the process of shifting from high carbon supply chains that have served us very well in terms of, bringing sort of health, wealth and happiness over many decades. But we've now got to shift to low carbon supply chains. They are very, very different, whether you're talking wind, whether you're talking solar, whether you're talking batteries, and whether we get into hydrogen or any of the other sectors. We're going to be talking about very quickly building completely new supply chains. And some of them, they come from different places, and some of them will require us to deal with supply chain risks at a scale from countries that we're not necessarily used to having that much dependence on. If we start thinking about bringing in electricity or hydrogen from North Africa, and there's all sorts of minerals, I think, that Jeff is going to talk about, and they come from parts of the world that we maybe not quite used to being reliant on in this way. The other thing that I want to do is also bring in the question of trade in services and in data, because there's almost no sector of this economy where there are just commodities. I mean, there are commodities, but almost everything manufactured now, even down to toys, even down to household appliances, actually has data and services embedded in it. And of course, first and foremost amongst those services, and Aditi started to talk about finance, we also need, whether you call it trade, but a world in which access to finance can cross borders is also one that's going to be more resilient and better for UK PLC. And I want to also raise the spectre of electricity trade. And this is something we've not really done that much of because there's been a few interconnections, but they've been quite marginal to the system. We're going into a world where electricity trade will be absolutely key, not just to the resilience of our supply chains as we bring in products and services and goods, but actually to the operation of our entire economy. We're building interconnectors to, whether it's to Norway, whether it's to Ireland, whether it's to the continent. We're increasing our dependence on electricity trading in both directions. What sorts of things from the experience in the low carbon world, what sorts of things go wrong? Well, it's the usual gamut of problems we'll get, in terms of lack of resilience. Pandemic has been quite a shock, actually less so than in many other areas, like perhaps around sort of food and medical supplies. But there's things like sharp spikes of demand. I think Jeff is going to talk more about how we're moving so fast that one country can change a policy and starve another country of supply. We've also seen, I'm not quite sure what the politically correct way of calling it, but we've seen state-sponsored theft of IP, which obviously is disruptive. We've seen mercantilism. Every country is aware that these are the new and growing industries, and they want to own a piece of it, and they're prepared to go to quite some extraordinary lengths to do so. So we've seen, good old-fashioned trade tensions probably being more disruptive in low carbon supply chains than any other single form of shock. What I would say is, okay, so what's the solution? Is the solution that we try to onshore, to use one of Richard's terms? Do we reshore? Do we onshore? Do we try and get everything into our own country in order to be able to control everything? Absolutely not. It's just not going to work. We don't have the cobalt that we need from the DRC. We don't have the manufacturing technologies that have been developed across Asia, not just China, also in Taiwan and South Korea and so on. We don't have all of the skills. We don't have access to the finance, and we can't solve these international dependencies. And therefore, our only choice is actually to lean in and try to make this a better and safer world for trade, because, like it or not, that is what we're going to be dependent on, in particular in these low carbon supply chains. And with that, Andrew, I'll hand back over to you doing your Marlon Brando impersonation, half in the shadows there.
Well, I suppose it would be worse if I was completely in the shadows, but thank you, Mike. I mean, I should perhaps, just by way of apology, let you know that the electronic blind system in this contraption decided to shut down earlier today. And this, of course, coincided with the first day of sunshine. So I do apologise for the slightly lugubrious impression that this projects. But in any case, Michael, thank you very much indeed. And I think, two reflections there. My first is the critical importance of thinking ahead to the industries of the future. This is a decarbonisation path that we are on. This presupposes certain things about what we'll be trading and what we'll be building in order to genuinely electrify the economy. And I think supply chains with a past historical focus, supply chains with a forward future focus ought to really occupy us just as much. And I think, as you talk about the mechanisms of the market, I'm sure we'll get onto this in the questions and answers, but it has been a moment in which the behaviours of many states have thrown into really sharp focus the importance, frankly, of standing up for free trade solutions, open market solutions to many of the problems that we're facing. The rush to mercantilism will only ever lead in one direction, I think. So without further ado from me, let me just now introduce somebody that I've been working with very closely recently, and it's been a pleasure to do so. So Jeff Townsend, who has set up, manages the Critical Minerals Association, to talk to us as our final panelist. And before I just let Jeff take over the baton, can I just also ask you all to please use the Q&A function and start putting questions in. It'd be very good to hear from all of you also what you think and what you'd like to hear us talk about later on in the session. But Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, very kind. Yes, so I'm Jeff Townsend, I'm from the Critical Minerals Association. So the CMA was set up a year and a bit ago to bring the industry in the UK together as a means of looking at the supply chain for the industrial strategy of the UK. So the UK, like its neighbours in Europe and like the Americans, it is very much pushing towards a high-tech industry and a net zero achievement by 2050, electrification. We're really focusing on wind power in the UK, but of course there's solar power as well. when you see a change in industrial strategy and industry, it's often, or is historically, partnered with that change in the power source of it. So we're moving from fossil fuels into electrified products, wind, solar, hydro. And if you look at the UK's 10-point plan to a green recovery, very good, very ambitious, we like that. Probably 7 of those 10 are dependent upon a supply chain of critical minerals. So when we determine critical minerals at the CMA, what we've done is we've broken those into 3 sections. The first are those that are critical to the industrial strategy and have a supply chain vulnerability. So things like cobalt, graphite. Then we have technical metals or technical minerals, those that don't have a supply chain vulnerability but are equally as important. Things like copper. You know, if you don't have copper but you've got everything else, you won't have an electric vehicle. You just have a very big, heavy paperweight. And then number 3 are strategic minerals. So strategic minerals are those that are either useful in defense or are very high tech, like space industry, have a diplomatic angle towards them, or can be seen to be used in future technology that's not necessarily being used yet or be designed yet, but could be in the future and is not currently being extracted globally at a significant stage. And that's really important because one country's strategic mineral is another country's critical mineral. And so understanding the diplomacy behind the actions of governments is really key when we look at why certain things have happened. So briefly, the critical mineral industry, in 1970s, China started looking at critical minerals. The rest of the world was focused on oil and coal and bulk commodities. And China decided what it would do is it would really focus on industrial strategy, what it thought we would need in the early 2000s. And they, by and large, got it right, which means that we now have a supply chain vulnerability within the critical minerals. You can't change where these critical minerals are based, that's geological, but you can determine where they are refined, where they're specified, beneficiated. And that predominantly takes place in China at the moment. So whilst we have that, we also see a race amongst friends, as we've discussed earlier. This isn't just the UK's industrial strategy. We share a very similar industrial strategy to other nations. So what we find is a race and a global situation where demand massively outstrips supply. One of the keys to this is if we go back to China. There are 172 gigafactories being built in the world at the moment. 130 are in China. China controls that midstream that is necessary for building batteries. And therefore, of course, it will always put its industry first. So that means that we find ourselves dependent on critical minerals that have to be put through the Chinese midstream, and with China vastly developing the upstream, the downstream compared to the world. So we have that kind of inflexibility. On top of that, we have diplomatic issues going on. We have America now doing a 100-day review. Where that will lead, we're not quite sure. But you really find then a market failure of free trade because of state actions. And there's a real result. The only way really to get around that actually is more free trade, but strategic free trade between Five Eyes nations, partner nations that see similar ambitions. Canada and Australia have wonderful deposits of critical minerals and can feed into that as we try to build a global supply chain, looking back to normality of free trade. I'll leave it there.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed for that. So let me just sort of cycle back now and perhaps go back to Richard initially. I mean, I'd just be interested, Richard, in any reflections that you had, having listened to the various panelists speak. And I'd be also kind of interested in, given that there are lots of representatives from the insurance industry on the panel, on the around the room, the virtual room today. If there's anything that you would sort of draw by way of conclusion that you think that they really ought to be focusing on in the context of supply chain resilience, sort of interested to know. Richard, back to you.
Okay, so I mean, one of the big things which caught everybody out was not actually understanding the extent of their supply chain. So I think that's one of the big things that everybody needs to really look at. So this whole thing of gaining transparency, asking what is the supply chain network I'm part of, because we recognize now the competition is not between those individual companies, it's between the supply chain networks they're part of. So where are your first tier suppliers located? Where are your second tier suppliers are located? And so on and so forth. Now that is a particular challenge for SMEs to be able to get that level of transparency, but all businesses need to be able to do that. So if we're actually starting to think about, understanding, we talk about ESR risks, as it were, thinking about, the environmental, social and governance risks of supply chains, actually understanding that and mapping that out becomes very, very important. And we've seen that, that is, if you like, one of the key things. So I often talk about location, location, location. Who are you actually trading with? What are those particular flows which are taking place? I think what we're moving into is also times of resource constraint. Whatever those resources are, it could be critical minerals. We're also hearing an awful lot of noise at the moment about, for example, vaccines. And we have global supply chains in place. It's global supply chains around all these things. So, one of the key things that I think everybody and government now need to become supply chain experts. Everybody needs to become a supply chain expert to understand, if you like, these critical interconnections which are actually taking place. And therefore, we've got to make sure that we've got these foundations in place for free trade, foundations in place for transparency and understanding the extent of these networks, and also ensuring that we know how to actually build those relationships. And I think that that's quite an interesting area for organizations, because I do believe that government can play a really important part in that, in facilitating the actual building of relationships globally. So I think that's what I would sort of conclude on, Andrew, and it'll be interesting to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Yes, thanks very much indeed, Richard. Well, let me bring Michael in next on this topic, and then Aditi.
Thank you very much. I would absolutely echo the importance of knowledge, of knowing where your supply chain is and going in multiple levels, because the curveball doesn't necessarily come from your first tier supplier, as Richard's pointed out. It could come from your second, your third, your fourth. There are 20 layers in some of these supply chains, and any one of them could be a bottleneck and could be a curveball. And what I would also suggest is that some of these curveballs, I mean, the ESG issues, we're also embarked on an attempt to track carbon emissions through the supply chain, because you could be held responsible for the carbon emissions also some levels down, up to 20 levels down in your supply chain. And you can wake up and your consumers have suddenly decided that such and such is bad, and that you are a user of that product, that service, that company, and therefore you're going to be boycotted or whatever. So these curveballs can come from multiple places. The importance of knowing your supply chain, it's probably a challenge beyond the capability, not just of SMEs, but frankly, it's beyond the capability of large companies, really to track it with the robustness and the dynamism and the sort of fraud resistance that is needed. There is technology that is sort of coming riding to the rescue, distributed ledger technology, blockchain. And we're going to be looking back, I think, in 10 or 15 years, we'll look back at the era of sort of fair trade coffee or organic labeling as being incredibly quaint and very important steps that were taken in sort of certifying supply chains. But we're going to have to essentially be able to track back in the way that perhaps so far only military manufacturers or aerospace manufacturers have really been able to say, okay, this screw came from this company and it was made on this day on this machine. We're pretty much going to have to go there right across, whether it's food or whether it's pharmaceuticals, just the amount of data, ESG, as well as resilience and customs information, carbon emissions information. All of that, essentially, that metadata is going to have to accompany, pretty much every sub-assembly or every piece of every product. I can't see any other alternative to solving, if we really want to address and solve these problems, which we clearly do.
And Mike, I'll stay with you for a moment. Could I just ask that very obvious follow-up question? Where do you see the leadership coming from on ESG in particular?
I think it's coming from. It's right at the moment, certainly on carbon and emissions, it's coming right across the value chain. It's coming from civic society. It's coming from Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and students and so on. But it's also coming from central banks. You have Christine Lagarde saying that central banks are going to tilt the playing field towards companies that are providing, good ESG solutions, particularly around climate. I think so. Investors at every stage, asset owners, asset managers. I actually think that the dark horse in the race is actually going to be accounting companies. And the reason I say that is that if you've got an operation which is exposed maybe to a supply chain step that you don't even know about in some country, that actually is a material financial risk. And it ought to be recognized potentially with a write down or with a qualification in your accounts. When that starts happening, you'll see the money will start to flow really, really fast, because people will wake up and say, there's just been, a write down on this or that operation because it's exposed to, it's only got one supplier of whatever, and that's risky. And that's now been recognized in a note to the accounts, not in an ESG statement, but in the note to the accounts or in the actual carrying value on the balance sheet. And I think when that happens, you're going to see some really fast action.
Michael, thank you. I'll bring Aditi in a moment, but just to note that sort of question in the chat relevant to all of this from Hamza. So maybe this would mean more professionals to help on better knowledge of the supply chain and tracking. Hamza also suggesting in the chat here, imagine an organization adapted, maybe another one that has a simple tool for SMEs to assess the resilience of their critical supply chains, maybe limiting the accountability of SMEs around the risks on those critical supply chains. But Aditi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I just wanted to say, pick up the point on planning, right? Something that both Richard and Michael brought up, that planning and understanding risks is very difficult, both for SMEs as well as larger firms. And I think this is perhaps where there's a very strong role government can play in developing a very simple guidance and understanding where the risks are, mapping those risks. Simple guidance on scenario planning, how, what are the standard scenarios, just as we're using scenarios in the financial industry now, what are the scenarios that supply chains can look at and test their suppliers and the sort of wider supply chain for. So I think that is really important, coming up with some very simple guidance, simple and standard guidance that can be used across firms of all sizes. The second thing that I wanted to say was on, because you mentioned insurers, I think insurers have a key role to play now in financing the building of resilience. First, because it's actually in their interest as well. It reduces the risk in their portfolios and increases the quality of credit. But they have a number of regulatory barriers which currently don't allow them to finance resilience within supply chains. So I think there's joint role of regulators and insurers to make sure that side of finance can be leveraged to finance the increased resilience of supply chains. Great.
And finally, Jeff, from ESG, obviously big in your world, particularly critical minerals. Lots happening in this space, lots not happening in this space. What's your reflection?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so let's look back to the Church of England and what they did as a investing block. They got together with their partners a lot in the pension schemes, and they effectively said, if the mining sector does not change its tailings dam standards, we will not invest in your mines. Now, these mines can cost up to 2 billion, 3 billion to build one, and it operates for 40 years. So you need a lot of money, and there's very few that are willing to give you that kind of money openly. So it used its financial power to make an ESG change to the way that mining is now done. And that's, I think, for me, is a first. And I'm really that's really impressive. But what I do think then is if we look at it the other direction, I think there's a social change. And what's been described to me as social capitalism, but I'm sure there's a way we'll find of actually giving it a proper title. But what we're starting to see is people putting a financial value against their morals or their ethics. So, are you willing to pay extra money for your downstream products, knowing that you can track the supply chain and track the ESG compliance throughout it? Because ultimately there will be a cost to that. Part of that cost, and going to my second point, is the legal ramifications of that. So when we bring in tracking, there's some brilliant companies out there. I'm a huge fan of one. There's a British firm that does a lot of this, works with some major companies. When you bring in that, you can track everything. But then you get to the point where, okay, you suddenly realize that there's a fault within the supply chain, whether it's on carbon, whether it's on human rights, whatever it may be. And whose fault is that legally? Is it the downstream company? Is it the company who carried it? Is it the one who took their product in the supply chain? There becomes a real big problem there in the legal. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done when we start moving these and understanding of supply chains, both on the legal, but also accepting what it can do. Because we want to build this green world. We want to have renewable energy. We want to have electric vehicles. This is what we need to bring in. So it's going to happen, and it needs to happen very, very quickly. So the opportunities to change the world, phenomenal, but it needs a lot of cooperation at an international level to really level that playing field and understand how that's going to open up a free trade solution to the supply chain.
And if I could just follow up on that, Jeff, if I may, you're very conscious, I know, that this is a year in which the UK is hosting COP26. This is a year in which we are president of the G7. Are there leadership opportunities here for the UK in terms of setting the pace? And if so, what do they look like? What should we be doing to try to create that international consensus, to drive that change in the international space?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So there's a lot that needs to happen at the G7 and COP26. But so I think the first one for me is really looking at partner nations. So the reality is you can't change your entire supply chain. We have some brilliant companies in the UK doing critical minerals, and they will provide some of our needs, but they're going to be a third of what we need totally. So I think looking to our partner nations and seeing where we fit in the supply chain, what our angle is, and how collaboration can happen, whether it be, Canada mining loads of cobalt and sending it over to the UK or the EU to be refined, because that shortens the transport distance, therefore knocks down the carbon output. So there's things like that. So that collaboration on a supply chain, physical. And on ESG leadership, look, I think absolutely at COP26, if you're trying to deliver sustainability goals, this is the key. Every single industry as we move forward is going to have to meet ESG compliance. I would suggest that if you look at the mineral side of things, a lot of the companies out there at the moment are exploration firms. So that's 2-3 people out there digging in the ground. I think they know what they're looking for. Their ability to deliver against that ESG compared to someone like Anglo American or Rio Tinto, a massive, FTSE 10 companies, is just, you can't compete. Therefore, there needs to be some kind of sliding scale that looks upwards, a base level for everyone, and then a scalability based on the ability of companies to meet ESG requirements, because that's the only way you will really have some kind of fair system.
Great. Well, listen, thank you all for that first round around the issues. We've got 15 minutes or so left. Let me just again emphasize the opportunity to pop a question in the chat. I'll go to one of those now, if I may. So Catherine Gaiman, in the current climate, when the focus is on reshoring with an emphasis on high-tech, high-value products, are we overlooking the low-tech, the low-value products that are nonetheless essential for our communities, e.g. low-cost generic drugs, often hugely constrained, and the focus on only one or two global players? So maybe, Richard, could I come to you first on that question?
Yeah, I think there has very much been an emphasis around high tech, because of course that's, if you like, these, high value entities. But I think, the question is quite right. There are certain items which are absolutely critical to modern supply chains and have a big impact on our society. And so therefore, those types of products also, we need to potentially create some capability in being able to manufacture those. And I think one of the big opportunities here is with technology. A lot of those items, you could argue, had moved, if you like, offshore and have been globalized. Why? Because of, potentially cheaper labor in certain places and so on and so forth. But with the automation that we've actually got coming online, supply chain 4.0, being able to have small footprint, highly automated manufacturing facilities, those things can now move back onshore, as it were, and be manufactured at a low cost because of the fact that we've actually got automation being able to actually make those particular things. So what we're actually finding now is, the fact that we used to be very promiscuous in where we would, if you like, procure things from globally because of labor costs. Labor costs now, in many situations, are becoming less of an issue because of the technology that we actually have available to us. So there are opportunities here. That isn't going to get away from, as we've been discussing, global trade. We're going to very much need global trade for certain things, but there are opportunities very much to be able to bring things actually onshore again. But I would see that for some of those if you like, particularly high-tech things, we might be manufacture them with high technology for our customers more locally. It's really about moving the manufacturing footprint close to where the customers are, and I think that's what we're going to be seeing is wherever possible, can we actually move that manufacturing close to where the market is? That may potentially be a trend, particularly driven by resilience as we move forward.
Aditi, I wonder if you had a thought on that. I think amongst us, we've also been talking about the role of the global south in this context. I mean, clearly at the point at which we're starting to think about how nearshoring, onshoring, reshoring starts to play a role economically, clearly this is going to buckle some pretty established global value chains and start to pose some quite interesting questions about the construction of the global economy. But obviously, there will be companies that will be thinking, particularly in the SME sector, about the opportunities this brings to be part of supply chains they might not previously have been part of. There are also some interesting questions about our relationships in economic and trade terms with countries more widely in the world. But Aditi, any thoughts on this topic?
I think on the topic of global south, I think SMEs are in general more concentrated in the global south, and particularly in sectors like manufacturing and agriculture. Given the level of their concentration where this tend to be, they tend to be more impacted. Also because, if we start thinking about climate change and impacts of climate change in the global south, they're pretty, there are a lot of risks from events like flooding in Bangladesh, for example, or droughts in countries like India. And these agricultural supply chains in particular are pretty linked, so they could lead to systemic risks globally because of the strong linkages within these value chains. And smallholder farmers, particularly in context of agriculture, smallholder farmers do not have a bargaining power when compared to large agribusinesses. So they tend to be impacted more disproportionately more than larger firms. And I think in that context, building resilience within these sectors, particularly in the global south, becomes even more important. So using nature-based solutions, for example, in agriculture, and even more diversification in terms of who sources from smallholder farmers. So I think there is a need to build resilience within the global south, and I think that's a really, really important question. I don't have a perfect answer to that, but that's definitely something that needs more attention.
I don't know if, Michael, you want to come back on that.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and Aditi. I echo your comments. It was just, I guess I was sort of reflecting on the conversation so far, and it was very much built around this assumption that we in essentially the OECD, we're the consuming nations, therefore we get to set the standards. The resilience is all about kind of making sure that our economy and our businesses stand up well and so on. But and I think Aditi's talked about the greater vulnerability in the global south. But also, as we play out in coming decades, I will confess that one of my worries is that the relevance of Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea actually becomes relatively less in the global economy, and a far greater proportion of trade is actually going to be South-South or South China. I'm not quite sure whether I'm not sure whether that qualifies anymore as South-South trade, but I do worry that we'll end up with, H.G. Wells' time machine. There were the Eloi who sort of lived this lovely effete lifestyle on the surface in the sun. And then there were the Morlocks who did all the work, who were down in the mines and hadn't got the luxury to worry about all the same sorts of concerns. And I do worry that we'll end up with this sort of two-speed economy where, we've got marvelous, resilient, low carbon, high tech, just supply chains, but actually the bulk of the global economy by 2040, 2050 might actually be, not involve us and not be held to the same high standards, not in terms of ESG and also potentially not in terms of resilience. So to come back to an earlier question, you said, well, where does the leadership come from? I think that there's got to be leadership from government to government to think that ahead, to plan ahead for that. And I think, the trade environment, and I noticed that there's been a sort of relaunch of some of the initiatives around resilience and ESG under the new leader at the WTO, under Ngozi at the WTO. And I think that's got to play a big role in all of this.
There's a question in the chat, which is sort of tangentially relevant but interesting, I think, and maybe it'll be our last, from Joe Mansour, who asks, in a globalized world, how can we ensure that requiring certain ESG standards when procuring, importing our goods doesn't lead to a country's competitive advantage? And he's thinking here about the debate around carbon leakage. So thoughts, maybe I could go to Richard first on this.
I think we have to always reflect that any decisions that we're making, also we're having to think about the environment, of course, we're having to think about, the economic impact, but also we're having to think about the social impact. And this is very much a trade-off we're having to consider. So, we could say, hey, we'll onshore everything into the United Kingdom, but that actually could have a really detrimental impact on other societies around the world. And if that starts actually taking place, that can lead to, you know, even more poverty, unrest, for example, which can therefore disrupt supply chains further. So I think we have to think very carefully about the application of, you know, if you like, our ESG methodologies, because it's not just about saying, oh, that's a horribly risky supply chain or country or organization to actually work with. Somehow we have to also align, and this is a real tricky one, because I think it's most definitely above my pay grade, is how do we align the values of the supply chain? You know, and we've seen this debate going on. You know, our value is we have no child labor. Well, what is, you know, my definition of child labour in my society may be very different to child labour in another society, and therefore how do we actually navigate that as we're moving forward? So we need to be quite careful, because we've even seen this with, you know, fair trade programs, that you can have sort of unintended consequences by interventions. We have to think very carefully about how these things work so that society as a whole can actually grow. Good impact on the environment, of course, and also a good impact, economic impact as well, hitting those three areas of sustainability.
Richard, thank you. Well, we're drawing to a conclusion here with 3 minutes to go, but I'm going to just squeeze one last drop of the juice out of this particular lemon and ask each of our panelists just to give us a final, literally 10-second closing thought. And I'm going to ask Michael first. Then I will ask Jeff, then Richard, and then Aditi to give us their final thoughts. So just draw conclusionary reflections from what you've heard today. Michael.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So if I go back to my opening remarks, really we are stuck with global supply chains. They are an inevitable feature of our modern economy, but even more so as we build the low carbon technologies in energy and transport and so on. So the things we've been talking about, the importance of information, of planning, of actually knowing your supply chain can't be overemphasized. And, you know, we were just opening up a really important discussion about how we deal, you know, how we optimize supply chains, not just for our own good, but also for the global south and for others, because we could otherwise see ourselves sort of locally optimizing our supply chains, but actually creating enormous instabilities through other countries that are excluded from that. So I guess my summary, I've ended up more confused or less knowledgeable than I started this session. I hope that's not true of all the audience, because, you know, it is just complicated, but these sorts of discussions are so important.
Well, knowledge is confusion, I think, Michael, I agree. So really 10 seconds, Jeff, then Richard, then Aditi.
Thank you, Andrew. So I do think there's a role for domestication of the midstream in critical minerals. I think that's part of the parcel. But when we look internationally, I think actually instead of talking about supply chains, we need to talk about partnerships. Because I think if we all look at it as individual nations or companies, I think that's where there's going to be a real problem. So partnerships is the key. And yes, confusing.
Richard.
Yeah, I think really picking up on that thing. Think location. We need to think global, but we need to learn how to manage relationships, individual relationships, but also relationships between nations and different economic areas.
And last word to you, Aditi.
Yeah, three things. Encourage planning by developing simple guidance, unlock finance, private finance for resilience, and encourage adoption of innovative models like digitalization.
Perfect. Well, listen, let me close by saying a very big thank you to Aditi, to Jeff, to Richard, to Michael for what I thought was a really interesting discussion. I hope you found it too. That was the point of it. But a really rich discussion, and I think we just began to scratch the surface here today. But thank you all for joining the Business of Resilience seminar. We're really proud to have you, proud to host this at the Department for International Trade. Wish you well with the rest of the events. And thanks to the team that organised this today. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.